You know, some might argue that the universe is conspiring to make this interview more difficult. First of all, Yasmine Mohammed, my guest for the broadcast, is a little bit under the weather, so I'm sure she's sipping hot tea and medications. I won't even go there, like I'm sure you're medicating. And also, we've had a few technical glitches, but I believe I've got you here on the line. Yasmine Mohammed, are you with me?
I am with you, Seth, despite Allah's best.
You know,
we did it.
Allah tried to prevent this desecration of the great religion of Islam. You know, Yasmine, we've talked in the past, you know, when I do shows about my former faith, Christianity, you know, a lot of people are like, well, why aren't you talking about Islam? I feel like we address Islam quite a bit, but there's probably a need for a lot more of this, especially in the West. Do you feel like there's a blind spot for many, I don't know, atheist activists or critics of religion when it comes to this specific religion? What's your take?
I think there is definitely a blind spot, but I don't know if it's necessarily from atheist activists. I think that the blind spot is just from the general uninformed public. And the blind spot is really frustrating and quite dangerous too. So when you think of somebody like Leah Remini, who left Scientology, she can talk about it. Everybody's there to support her and hear what she has to say. She has a show where she speaks to the victims of Scientology, and everybody empathizes with them. Saying for people that have left the Westboro Baptist Church or any fundamentalist sect of Christianity, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, et cetera, there's a lot of support for people who leave those communities. Unfortunately, people who leave the Islamic community, we don't have any support at all from the people who we would expect to be supporting us. So we're left just floating in between. Our families have disowned us. Our communities have discarded us, and we're also not being embraced by the liberal, free-thinking West that we expected to find some sort of refuge with. So,
okay, well, I want to stop you right there if I can. I just finished your book, Unveiled. Your subtitle is How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam. I kind of wish it would have said how many Western liberal, because I'm a Western guy, I'm a liberal, right? I'm on the left, but I'm a critic of Islam. I know we're out there, so certainly not all. You know, tell me what informed the subtitle. Are we just talking about the Ben Affleck types or what?
Well, you know, technically the subtitle should have been How Some Western Liberals Unintentionally Empower Radical Islam, but that takes away from the whole zing of it. It's not very provocative at that point. But yes, obviously, hashtag not all. That could be said about any statement that's ever made, ever. It's always yes, not all. But in general, Western liberals are failing to support liberal Muslims. And they unintentionally are not, because really the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They are supporting radical Islam. They are supporting the fundamentalist Muslims.
Okay, so when I mention Ben Affleck, for those without context, he's a guest with Sam Harris on Bill Maher's show on HBO. This was years ago. Famous conversation where Bill Maher and Sam Harris were criticizing Islam as an idea, as a religion. And Ben Affleck loses his mind and says, that's gross, that's racist.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people, and that's a problem.
Big of you.
But
why are you so hostile about this concept?
It's gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so nuts.
It's like saying
it's so nuts. You're
shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
You guys are saying if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles like freedom of speech, like we are endowed by our forefathers with inalienable rights, like all men are created equal.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Immediately we see the problem, right? Islam being an idea, not a race. But this seems to be the attitude among many progressives. They are terrified of criticizing or challenging Islam because they don't want to be called a racist, right?
Absolutely. And especially, this was especially rich coming from Ben Affleck, who did a movie, Dogma, which was all about criticizing religion. It was all about criticizing Christianity specifically. And so he's obviously open to that. He obviously understands the importance of criticizing these ideologies. But when it comes to criticizing Islam, all of a sudden it's like, oh, no, but that one is off limits. And again, when I mentioned it being dangerous, the reason why this is dangerous is because there are victims under there. There are people that are being ignored. So one of the statistics that came up in that conversation was, so Sam Harris and Bill Maher were talking about how 86% of Egyptian people believe that if you leave Islam, you should be executed. So that's a startling and scary statistic. And as a person who left Islam and whose family comes from Egypt, that's a very personally startling statistic to know that 86% of your people want you dead, right? And so that's a very important thing for us to be talking about. We really need to be addressing that. But instead, I can't tell you how excited and happy I was to see Sam Harris and Bill Maher addressing that on national television and mainstream media. I've been watching Bill Maher since I was a teenager. I just couldn't believe that they actually cared about us, that they were going to start to even address people like me. They were going to start to address people being hacked to death in the streets of Bangladesh or being killed by their peers in universities in Pakistan, or women being imprisoned for removing their hijab, or all of the people that are suffering because of fundamentalist Islam. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And then to have the white knight Ben Affleck jump up and silence them was really just the most, it was just a dagger of betrayal. It really was. It was so hurtful to see that happen. I know that he thinks that he's helping, but this is why the ignorance is so dangerous, because if he understood the entire, what these men were actually talking about, then he would understand that he's the one who's not helping, that he's doing the opposite of what he wants to do. He's stopping the victims from being heard.
I want to come back to some of this, but first, after reading your story, let's get into a little bit of your story for the podcast and live stream audience. You were the victim of abuse. I hate to start there, but I just feel that's the part of the first third of the book, and then you sort of echo that as you move forward. You were the victim of physical violence in the name of Allah, in the name of Islam. Was it religiously excused, or was this something else?
No, it's absolutely religiously excused, and that's why my story is echoed over and over and over again throughout the Muslim majority world. There is a hadith that says to hit your child if they do not pray or if they do not memorize Quran. So that's what's happening. And hit is a very subjective word. Same thing like when Allah instructs men to beat their wives that they fear might be arrogant or disobedient. Very subjective. So the way that people beat their children or beat their wives is varied. Some people don't beat their children or their wives at all, and some people brutally beat their children and their wives. So when you have that sanctioned in the religion, you can't cry for help because Allah has decreed this. So who are you as a mere human to complain about something that Allah has specifically sanctioned in the religion?
It's interesting you give an anecdote about how that you were supposed to be quoting from the Quran correctly. And when you get it wrong, you are beaten. The word of God literally beaten into children?
Yep. And that's the thing. It's like, you kind of have that a little bit in Christianity too, which is like, you have to love God or he's going to burn you in hell for eternity. So, you kind of have that same concept, but on Islam, it's just on steroids. And that's the thing. Like when online, people are always sharing these YouTube videos of kids being beaten by their Quran teachers. Ayan Hirsi talks about it in her book too, where her Quran teacher smashed her head into the wall. He actually cracked her skull. these stories are endless of madrasas that beat the kids, beat the word of an all-loving, all-merciful, all-compassionate God into these kids. And then we're surprised that they grow up to become ex-Muslims.
As a segue, then we have to talk about the sexual abuse that is covered up and even excused, rationalized, right? It was the Prophet Muhammad married a 6-year-old and raped at 9 years old, and this is embraced by fundamentalist Islam. Is that used as an excuse for child marriage and child rape in fundamentalist cultures, in fundamentalist Islam?
I mean, absolutely. Not only is it used as an excuse, it's actually encouraged, because as a Muslim, you should try to live your life as closely to the way the Prophet Muhammad lived his. And so when there are Muslim majority countries that try to change the laws and try to increase the age of marriage, they get fought down by fundamentalists that say, who are you as a human being to change, what the Prophet Muhammad has done? So if the Prophet has already decreed, not just decreed, but that's his example, right? He's the best example for all humanity for all time. And if he married a 6-year-old, then nobody is going to be able to step forward and say that nobody under the age of 16 or whatever age they were trying to increase it to. That's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. The fundamentalists won't let it happen because it's already codified in the religion. And that's why it's a problem, because it prevents progress from happening. A lot of people in these cultures want progress. They obviously, if you're gay or if you're a woman or if you're a minority, you don't want to be held down by Sharia. You want to push forward and, get into this century. But as long as that religion is intertwined in the laws, it's almost impossible for that to happen.
When you talk about reciting the scriptures, I've noticed this in my own conversations. I mean, I encounter Islamists or devout Muslims who are promoting their religion. It's a little different than seeing the apologist in Christianity. It's like when they pray. There's a uniqueness to it. I mean, you can see similarities, but they add their own panache to it. In Islam, there's a lot of rote recitation. It's like the difference between memorization and true understanding. I hear a lot of Allah is great, Allah is good, Islam is pure, Islam is truth. But beyond that, if you get into the nuance of their faith, they just blink at you. What's the story there?
Because we're not taught to think or to understand. We're taught to regurgitate. So in Islam, like Muslims, when you value somebody, like you say, like, oh, he's such a great Muslim, you say he's a hafiz, and that means he has memorized the Quran. So when somebody wants to prove what a good Muslim they are, they'll tell you, I memorized half the Quran, or I memorized the whole Quran. It's all about memorization. Nobody sits down to talk about what this means, because to do that is almost blasphemous, because you have to just accept it. You have to swallow this entire book whole. To question it is out of the question. The most tragic part of this is over 85% of Muslims don't speak Arabic. They're not Arabs. Arabs are a minority of Muslims. And so they are regurgitating this book, they are memorizing this book, and they have no idea what they're saying. So there are imams all over Pakistan and India and Afghanistan and all these non-Arab speaking countries that are just saying whatever they want to say. And people are all listening to them every Friday, yeah, sure, nodding their heads. They have no clue. They somehow believe that their religion is whatever this imam happens to say. And they don't ever stop to read the Quran in their own language and to understand it on their own, because that's just not the culture of Islam. That's not the tradition of Islam. The tradition is to just memorize and regurgitate. And that's what's celebrated. And you'll see videos online of kids in madrasas in Pakistan that are just like swaying back and forth, just repeating these words. It's like it's just so cultish. It's freaky to see that.
Like they made little
they have
parrots.
no idea what they're saying.
I mean, just they just have them regurgitate the language. Is the same true with the prayers? 5 times a day,
Yes. They
turn and do the prayer, and there's no nuance in the prayer. Is it just the very same thing every time? It's very similar. The only variation that you can have is that you can choose a different chapter from the Quran to read. But everything else is very similar. To give you the best sort of physical representation of this is look at Hajj. Look at, those aerial views of people going around the Kaaba. Everybody's all dressed in white. They literally look like sheep. That is what Islam is. Everybody look alike, act alike, speak alike, and just follow the herd. Don't think. This is why I describe it as a school of fish. You don't think, don't ask questions. In fact, asking questions and thinking is dangerous. You'll get in trouble for it. Just get in line, shut your mouth, and follow along. Don't ask questions. And anybody who does, of course, gets severely attacked by the rest of the herd because they consider any sort of dissent like that to be just blasphemous. How devout were you? I don't know how else to ask the question. Like, how good a Muslim were you at the time?
I was as devout as they come. I was as good as I could possibly be. I did everything that I was supposed to do. I took it to the limit. And the reason why I did that was because I was actually just vying for my mom's love and approval. And I thought that if I do everything that she wants me to do, I might actually attain that. And also because I was terrified of burning in hell for eternity. I was terrified of all of the punishments that are described in great gory detail of what's going to happen to you in the grave and, as you're waiting for the day of judgment even. And then when the day of judgment happens, then you get thrown into a pit of fire. So these punishments that now when I read them are, just make me roll my eyes. As a child, I certainly wasn't rolling my eyes. They were incredibly terrifying. And you get that ingrained in you so that I've spoken to so many ex-Muslims that even after they leave, this is true for me too, even after I left the religion and I didn't believe in any of it anymore, you're still scared. You're still irrationally afraid because you've just had that fear in you for so long. So I was so devout, Seth, that I wore niqab. That means I covered my face entirely. Even like my eye hole thing, I had a cloth that came down over it. And I wore the gloves and the thick socks. And I married a jihadi, for goodness sake. I was, everything short of, he was trying to get me to move to Afghanistan. And literally everything short of becoming an actual, if ISIS had happened during that time, then there is, it's quite possible that I would have been dragged to Syria or northern Iraq and been one of those women.
I'm going to come back to the marriage with the Al-Qaeda member. You mention in the book, correct me if I got it wrong, your mother made you swear that you would be prepared to kill a non-believer in the name of Allah. Did I read that right?
Yeah, that is true. That happened all the time. That was a very common occurrence. And that wasn't just me. That was in the Islamic school that I was attending. That's what they teach us. And that's what they say in the Friday khutbah, in the Friday sermons. So that's very common. You have to be, when the caliphate rises, you have to be prepared to join the Ummah, the community of Muslims, and fight against the non-Muslims. You always know that that's a possibility and that it might happen, and you have to be ready to raise a sword when that happens. And that's why when ISIS came up so quickly, you had kids from Germany and the UK and Belgium and all over the Western world running to go join ISIS. And everybody was like, wow, ISIS did some recruitment online. No, they didn't frickin' recruit on you. How do you think that anybody could recruit a totally normal child that was like attending university and they've born and raised in the West, and they have a middle class upbringing, and all of a sudden you can turn that child into somebody who's willing to join a terrorist organization within like a month? What kind of recruiting is happening online? It had nothing to do with the recruiting online. These kids already had those ideas in their heads. And we can see that, like Shamima Begum, who was one of the ISIS brides that was trying to return back to Britain, when they went back into her life, they found that her and her friends, their fathers had been taking them to attend rallies with Anjem Choudary, who is a well-known UK terrorist, where they're like burning the American flag, burning the Israeli flag in the streets of London, UK, burning effigies of American presidents and whatnot. These kids have been raised with all of this stuff in them since birth. So when the caliphate rose, they were like, oh, here it is. Now, when we're told those things, you don't really ever think it's going to happen in your lifetime. It's kind of like when a Christian is told, oh, the Messiah is going to return or whatever. It's like, yeah, sure, okay, that might happen. Maybe you believe it, but you don't think it's actually going to happen in your lifetime. It's just kind of this thing that you're taught. But that's how we're taught about the caliphate. Now, my mom started to make it personal because she would sit me down and mention specific people in my life that I was friends with to make sure that I was, to prove that I was loyal to the cause. So, yeah, that's a common thing, unfortunately.
From the book, Unveiled, How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam, by author and guest Yasmine Mohammed, you talk about the arranged marriage. With your permission, I want to read just a couple of paragraphs. It says, the Islamic ceremony was a strange and stupid, quote, wedding. All the women were upstairs, all the men were downstairs. I never even saw the creature I was marrying. I just sat in the living room, robed in black from head to toe. The imam asked the prescribed questions. My consent was not necessary. Silence is consent, according to Islamic law. And within minutes, I was his wife, his property. Quite fittingly, months later, in her fake husband's bedroom where I'd been coerced into vile situations as a child. I was coerced into a vile situation as an adult, the celebration of my marriage. I sat there as strange women did my hair and makeup. I kept crying and ruining their work, but they would just touch it up again. Not one heartless witch thought it strange that this young girl kept crying. Not one of them thought to say to my mom, what are you doing? Probably because they would all do the same to their own daughters in a heartbeat. There was food but no music because that's haram. There were no pictures being taken either because the idiot I was about to marry believed that photographs were haram too. Anything with faces is forbidden, even dolls. You finish this section by saying, holding back the tears was proving too much. I had to let go. I had to release the pressure, or I would end up in another full-on panic attack, and I had to avoid that at all costs. Panic attacks are too painful and too terrifying. You continue, and then you say, many years later, when the internet became a thing, I came across countless pictures of Muslim brides crying at their weddings. As alone as I felt that day, I now know that I was not alone.
Yes, it's very common, and unfortunately a lot of people don't realize that this kind of thing is happening in the West too. They think, oh, it's just happening over there. It's not on our watch. There's nothing we can do about it. But it is happening everywhere. I was just speaking to a woman from Australia who was, God, there's so many of them, but they talk about escaping their arranged marriages. So, and Ayan Hirsi Ali, again, she talks about escaping her arranged marriage. I didn't escape mine partially because of my fear of, not listening to my mother and then having to burn in hell because heaven is at the feet of your mothers, but also because I wanted my mother's approval. But, this is an incredibly common thing in the Western world, and they've started now to have campaigns to try and support these girls, but the thing is it's such a slow, insidious thing. Like you kind of always know that it's going to happen your whole life, and so you accept it when the day comes because you've been prepared for it. And you don't want to disappoint your family. In Australia, in the bathrooms, they have these posters up that say, like, you know, if you're being forced out of the country, or if you're being forced into a marriage, because that's usually what they do. They usually take them, like, okay, we're going to go to Sudan for the summer, and then the girl gets married there, and you never hear from her again. In my case, it actually happened in Canada, but quite often girls they just end up going for a holiday with their families and then never come back home again. They get forced into a marriage. So this advertisement in the bathroom had these text messages, supposedly, that are coming from family members that were saying things like, oh, just marry him. It'll be fine. You don't want to disappoint your family. If you don't marry, another text message, if you don't marry him, I'll never speak to you again. And all of these different, they know the coercive things that we're being told in order to get us to marry whoever it is that our family wants us to marry. And in my case, they wanted me to marry him so badly because I was always like a problem child. I asked too many questions. I pushed too much. And so they needed to marry me off to somebody who was like, quote, literally strong enough to control me, was what my mom was thinking. So
an abusive and violent man. You describe it in great detail in the book. And not just violent, but it turns out he was so much more, right? A member of a terrorist organization. You want to get into that just a little bit?
Yeah. So after our divorce is when I was able to learn more about him, actually. At the time, I was told, I was like, so I knew he came into Canada. Okay, there's a lot of things. When I had taken my mom to the hospital, and so it was like, calling 911, ambulance came, picked her up. She was bleeding from her nose and her mouth simultaneously. And so I went to the hospital with her. That was the first time in my entire marriage that I was away from him, like that I wasn't with him or my mom, that I was alone. And I was approached by CSIS, who are the Canadian CIA. And they told me that the man that I married had entered Canada with a fake Saudi Arabian passport. He's Egyptian, and he entered Canada via Afghanistan. So that's really a lot of red flags, right? An Egyptian man with a fake Saudi Arabian passport coming from Afghanistan to Canada. And what do? They give him refugee status. And initially, actually, they arrested him. And then some money came up to pay his bail and to pay for his lawyer. And they discovered that money had come from bin Laden directly. He'd sent it with one of his people who came up from California and paid Assam's bail and paid for like the best lawyer we had in BC at the time, immigration lawyer. And Assam was in Afghanistan ever since he was a teenager, working with bin Laden. I was told at the time that he was like just driving the Red Crescent. It's like the Red Cross. He was driving ambulances. He's a peacekeeper. He would train little boys on how to protect themselves from the Russians, things like that. But I later learned, because he's now imprisoned and there was a huge court case and all of the details came out, that he was actually one of the people that trained the bombers of the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And so he's, he's way worse than I thought he was when I was married to him. I didn't know all of these things about him, but they didn't surprise me. I knew, I suspected, I'm like, who would go to Afghanistan unless you're a mujahid. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody leave Egypt and go to Afghanistan if they weren't a jihadi? But, I wasn't told the truth.
I'm interested in how someone gets out of that, right? Because you don't have the authority under Islam to get the divorce or force a divorce, right? You have to go to him and ask. You have to go to a terrorist and ask for a divorce, right?
Yeah, and he wouldn't give it to me. So that was his thing. He's like, you can go ahead and get your Canadian divorce all you want. Doesn't matter. It means nothing. It's just a piece of paper. Islamically, you're still married to me. And in heaven, he gets to say who he wants as his wife for eternity. And so he said, you can run away from me all you want here on earth, but for eternity, I'm going to do what I want to you in heaven. So this is my heaven. This is what I have to look forward to, being married to this fucker.
Are you safe, Yasmine, though? I mean, right now, are you safe from this guy? That's my first concern, right? That's
the reason why I didn't speak out all of these years. Even though he was in prison, I still didn't feel safe. But mostly I was afraid for my daughter. So I know that he might want to take revenge on me, but that's very small compared to his desire to raise his daughter as a good Muslim. So he would want to basically kidnap her from me to make sure that she's raised in an Islamic household. So I was petrified. That's why I changed my daughter's name and my name. And we moved cities immediately because I didn't want him or his people to be able to find us. Now, I knew he was in prison, but I also knew he was a member of Al-Qaeda. And I know that their cell is huge and that they're spread all over the West. And so I wasn't taking any chances. I had no connection with anybody from my community or anything. No roads were leading to me or my daughter for 15 years. And my daughter is now an adult and she's safe, and we're not living in the same house anymore. She's moved out. And so that's when I started to feel like, okay, now I can speak out, because even if he is able to find me, that he's not able to find her.
I want to take a detour into a very touchy part of the book. I'm going to approach this as respectfully as I can, but we got to be direct, right? We're direct speakers. I think we're both approaching this with the intent to see good win the day. According to Islam, and you declared this in the book, only Muslims have value.
Yeah.
There is a particular contempt for the Jews, who are considered subhuman. The Jews are blamed for a huge number of problems in the world, big and small. So this informs like the Palestinian refusal to accept the state of Israel because they're illegitimate, those types of things. And then you get into headlines about people like, and you can correct me, but Muslim Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who has said some anti-Semitic things or been charged to say some anti-Semitic things as a Muslim. This is an attitude that you are seeing even in the West, an anti-Jewish or anti-Semite attitude from Islam, the religion. I'll just leave that out there and you can take it wherever you want, okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The Quran describes Jews as apes and pigs. Talks about how dirty they are and how they're the lowest of the low and basically subhuman, like all over the religion of Islam. That's the doctrine itself. And then in practice, to call somebody a Yehudi is like worse than calling them, I don't know what.
You
it's
don't
like
have
the
to
worst
say the slur, but I think I get what you're saying.
It's the worst insult. And
is there, though, a remaining prevalent attitude among Western Muslims about Jews? Are you seeing that?
It doesn't matter if they're Western or Eastern. It's it's the water you drink, it's the air you breathe, if you are raised in an Islamic household, that's just a given. That's just you just know that. It's repeated all the time. It's said all the time, not just necessarily even in religious contexts, but the example I give in my book is we were at the market with my aunt, and she's like, oh, the cucumbers and tomatoes are so small this year. She's like, you got to be careful. Those Jews, they put cancer in the vegetables and it makes them small. And I was like, what?
Wow.
And, I was speaking to a friend of mine who grew up in Russia, and he was saying that they have a saying there that says, when the water doesn't come out of the taps, blame the Jews. It's the same sort of thing. Like, Jews are just blamed for everything. They're somehow, they control they control the weather, for goodness sake. Everything is the Jews' fault. So they're simultaneously super powerful and also super evil. And so there's in the Quran, in a hadith, it also talks about how Muslims are going to kill all the Jews, and as the Muslims are fighting the Jews, even the rocks and the trees will help. So if a Jew tries to hide behind a rock, the rock will say, "Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew behind me." So it's like even the planet itself hates Jews.
They're an aberration of nature, according to Islam. Do you see echoes of that? I mean, I'm not trying to get you to name names, but I see high-profile people like Linda Sarsour, et cetera. I mean, are we seeing echoes of that there, to be honest, or is that just hyperbole?
Oh, it's much more than an echo. She has specifically said that we should not humanize Israelis when she was talking about the enemy, right? She does not, they're not even hiding it. See, a friend of mine in LA was saying that she was a teenager and she said something about Jewing down, somebody some sort of, eBay transaction.
Thing,
yeah. And she said, and her friend was like, Liz, what are you saying? Like, oh my God, I can't believe you just said that. And she was like, what? She'd never put two and two together. She'd never even realized that was an anti-Semitic thing to say. She was just saying it the way you say break a leg or something like that. She never thought of the meaning behind it. And it wasn't until her friend sort of shook her out of it and said, no, like, this is what you're saying. And she was like, oh my God, like, I didn't know. So that's kind of like when we talk about people like Linda Sarsour and Ilhan Omar, a lot of people make this assumption that, I don't know if they are, well, I know Linda is. I do know they are, actually.
You have assessed, you have analyzed their words and actions and come to the conclusion that they are anti-Jewish?
Yeah, so there is that. What I want to say is, within the Muslim community, there are a lot of Muslims who have never met a Jewish person in their life and who just have this impression and this idea and this knowledge that Jews are horrible, evil, disgusting, scary, criminal, et cetera, but they've never actually even thought about it. It's like the boogeyman, you don't sit there and think about, well, why am I scared of the boogeyman? What is the boogeyman's life? Like, how did he become the boogeyman? You don't think of it. It's just the way it is. They are the enemy. End of discussion, right? You have puppets that are teaching kids on Palestinian television about how Jews are the enemy and we need to kill them and whatever. So it's something that it's in the water from your first, breath.
طيب اسمع يا صديقي في عندكم يهود صديقي يا قيس
هسه لا
طيب انا سمعت هم بيجوا عليكم كل يوم
بس هسه لا
طيب اسمع يا صديقي اعمل ايدك هيك
مخيم
لما يجوا عندكم اضربهم بوكس خلي وجهه بنداره
ان شاء الله عشان نحرر فلسطين
ان شاء الله.
I saw a children's program where they had a beloved child's character. It's, I don't know, someone in a costume, an animal costume. And in this children's program, that beloved character was murdered in the set, on the screen, on the television show. And the murderer was Jewish. So, I mean, immediately as a child, they are reinforcing the fear and the hatred. So I get what you're now, because I'm watching the comment section, I can already tell people are going to be saying, well, is Seth trying to legitimize the state of Israel, blah, blah, blah. And look, I have my concerns about the state of Israel. I'm not trying to say, I'm not making commentary about the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And I understand Zionists, and I understand that if you're a Christian, you believe the state of Israel is part of the end times narrative, and there's a whole other shit ton of stuff to talk about. Well, we're talking now about the attitudes in Islam toward a specific demographic of people, and that's what I want to address, right?
It is important, though. It does overlap, because so all of this hate for Jews is the reason why Palestinians will not sit down and have a two-state solution. So they are actually, it's counterproductive. They're hurting themselves. They're not allowing their own people to live in peace because they are refusing to even acknowledge Jewish people as human beings allowed to have a safe place to live.
Like I, as a white Western male, I'm over here looking across the ocean. I'm like, I personally don't have a problem with the Jewish people having a state. I have a problem with the narrative that plays it into, like the return of God and the end times and the rationalization, the religious, superstitious rationalizations for doing so.
Exactly. And it's the religious superstitions on the other side that are stopping the peace.
Yeah. It's because they believe that it's divine destiny, divinely propelled, that no one will budge, no one will talk.
Yes, and they have that on both sides, right? They've got the fundamentalist Jews on one side that are like, oh, this is divinely ordained, and then you've got the fundamentalist Muslims on the other side saying the opposite is divinely ordained. So, they're two gods. They're supposedly the same God, but he has a differing opinion when he was speaking to both of these groups. So that's the reason for it not just being the same sort of conflict like anywhere else in the world, because a lot of other countries, let's take America, for example, a lot of other countries have a really, let's say questionable, if not sordid history of how they became, owners of this land. But today, right now, where we are at this point in history, how are we going to move forward for, safety and freedom for all? We have to,
You have to establish a starting point somewhere, while acknowledging, not ignoring the past, but establishing a starting point. Is that your point?
That's my point. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Well, I know you're under flu medication or cold medicine, but actually you're an amazing guest, and I'd like to keep you for a few more minutes before you go back and recover. And thank you. Yasmine Mohammed is my guest, author and activist and friend of several years, and I so appreciate you. Let's talk about the veil. Okay? We got to talk about the veil, especially when it comes to Western feminism, which is related to in the subtitle of your book. First of all, describe the veils for me. The hijab covers the hair, and the other is it niqab?
Yeah. So part of the issue here is that there's different languages using different words to describe similar things. And it's worn in slightly different ways in different parts of the Islamic world. But essentially, in a nutshell, hijab is the one that covers everything but the hands and face. I mean, that's the way it's used. The word hijab is all of these things together, but the way it's commonly used is hijab covers everything except for the hands and face, and niqab also covers the hands and face. So that's just the little nutshell. You'll hear chador, which is what Iranians call it, and you'll hear shela, which is what people in the Gulf countries call it. You'll hear burqa, which is what it's called in Afghanistan. You know what I mean? But essentially, those are the two groups.
So everything if I say hijab, if I say hijab, I mean covering. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
If I misspeak, just correct me. Everybody else does. I saw this article a few years ago. It was Azra Namani, who's a Muslim, was talking about to Western or non-Muslims rather to stop trying to show solidarity with Muslim women by wearing the covering.
Yes.
Her reasoning was, though, that they have, the apologists have analyzed the Quran and they've come to the conclusion that the covering is really not necessarily required. It's certainly not a tool for dehumanization. So non-Muslims aren't really showing solidarity because the covering isn't all that big a deal to begin with. That's what I got from the article. Your claim, though, your position is that you cannot extricate the covering from the religion. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I understand Usra's point. And in a utopia, maybe her point would be better accepted. But the reality is women are being imprisoned and killed and beaten and abused all over the world for not wearing hijab. So for us to just claim, oh, but it has nothing to do with Islam is not really helpful, because obviously a huge percentage of Muslims believe that it does. And that's because of things like in the Quran, it specifically states that women should cover themselves in order to differentiate themselves from the non-believers so that they won't be harassed, because non-believers don't cover up. So it's different. It's kind of a word that could be harassed, assaulted. Basically, it's a euphemism for being raped. So cover yourself up so that you can differentiate yourself from the women that you cannot rape versus the women that you can rape. And then there are hadith that say things like, if the women in hell are hung by their hair with their braids boiling if they do not cover their hair from men on earth. So there is legitimate religious justification. And forget the religious, just real life. There are most Muslims believe that hijab is part of the religion, and not just part of the religion, but it's fard, it's mandatory. And so we have to address that. We have to deal with that. We can't just pretend that it has nothing to do with Islam, because obviously it does. And the problem with that's part of the issue with trying to reform Islam, is it comes from a really good intention to say, this has nothing to do with Islam, guys. You can just stop now. But it doesn't work that way. Most Muslims are still gonna follow it. And
from the outside in, Yasmine, I'm interested to see that in certain groups, they're defending it by saying, women are precious. This is how we honor women. It's like protecting a precious jewel. We're talking about an instrument of dehumanization, right? It removes identity and all of these other horrible things.
I mean, there's no way that the same people who cry out to free the nipple somehow, suddenly, their brains just believe that this is a tool of empowerment and freedom and feminism. There's no way that the same brain can believe those two things. And it makes me so angry that they think that they only deserve freedom, and that women over there are happy and they love it and they like dressing themselves up like this. They like being dehumanized. They like being subjugated. They like being forced to wear. The hijab is just it's the physical representation. So when we see a slave in chains, we know that it's not specifically the chains that are making this person a slave. Do you know what I mean? But when you remove the chains, then there is an opportunity for that slave to be free. So that's exactly how I look at the hijab. That's exactly how most women, most Muslim women, most not ex-Muslim women who are trying to get themselves out of the hijab, that's how we look at it. We look at it as remove this thing off of your head and allow your head to be free. And the next step will be allowing your mind to be free. Because if they control what goes on your head, they are controlling what goes on in your head. And I have seen this happen time and time and time and time again of women who finally have the strength to decide what they're going to put on their own bodies, and they deal with the backlash. They deal with their families, they deal with their friends, they deal with their community, they deal with the people at school, and they're like, no, this is what I'm doing. And once you've done that, you have overcome a mountain. And then you can, after that, say, oh, and also, I'm not going to marry that man that you told me to marry. And also, I am not going to go to that school that you're telling me that I am going to go to the school that you're telling me I'm not allowed to go to school, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I fight against the hijab, that's really what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for women to decide for themselves what they want for their lives. And that first step is deciding what to put on your bodies when you wake up in the morning.
So when you see the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition featuring a model in the veil, right? They think they're celebrating culture. And your point is you are actually helping to, you're not telling someone what to wear. Well, like the idea is not forcing someone not to wear the hijab, but to say you are celebrating something that is actively being used as a tool of dehumanization and oppression, and you are validating it and giving them ammo to do so in those cultures. Did I express that correctly?
Perfectly. You expressed it perfectly.
Okay.
Now, the only comparison that I can give with the lunacy of having a fundamentalist clothing on the cover of Sports Illustrated is when I compare it to, if you had a model in Mormon underwear on the cover of Sports Illustrated, everybody would be like, what the heck? Why? This is like, you would know how ridiculous it is. But everything that, there is no real comparison between that world and this world. But all of what you said is absolutely true. So not unlike the Mormon underwear, which is just, it would be ridiculous, but Mormons aren't forcing people under threat of imprisonment and death to wear this underwear, right? Women aren't being, in the streets, have their underwear on sticks and saying, please let us be free to wear whatever underwear we want to wear. You're not seeing that. So it's not even a perfect comparison, but what you said is absolutely true. So what you're doing is you're taking this tool of misogyny, this tool that perpetuates rape culture, and you're putting it on the cover of your magazines as if it's something to be celebrated, as if it's something to be honored. It is infuriating. It really is, when there's not just women all over the Western world that are, look at, there's a model named Dina Tokyo who is living in the UK. Her family is from Egypt. And she is a model, a hijabi model, right? A modesty model. So she got famous through wearing hijab and, whatever, wrote books and stuff like that, has a huge following on social media. She decided that she was going to take her hijab off. Wow. The backlash in the United Kingdom was unbelievable. She has a video online where she does nothing but just read the hate, the death threats, the rape threats to her and to her family. The video is almost an hour long where she does nothing but read the hate. That's one tiny little example of how women, the backlash that we receive when we decide what we're going to put on our heads. For me, my mom, that's when she threatened to kill me, was when I took my hijab off. And then we're taking this thing and we're putting it on the cover of magazines.
Did you get hate mail? I saw the video where you were giving a demonstration. It was like an auditorium of some kind, and you took off a veil, like you sort of an expression of what that liberation feels like. I'm sure you probably got your share of hate and death from the critics, from, the agents of terror out there, right?
Yeah, I get those every day, all the time. They get super irate when I do things that allow the Western world to see the lunacy in what they are peddling. So for the longest time, they have been able to peddle this idea that hijab is empowering and it's feminist, and they've been getting away with it. And feminists have been like, oh yeah, okay, maybe it is. Sure, yeah, sounds right. and so when I come along so that was at a talk that I did at Harvard University, where I put the niqab on, and then I took it off, and I passed it to people in the audience, and I said, put it on your head. Cover your face with this, men and women, and tell me how empowered you feel. It's just ridiculous. It is ridiculous. You cannot wrap a human being up in a death shroud and then say that they are empowered. I mean, you had in Wales, they had a woman in niqab that was on their posters for one of their political parties, and she was like, I am Wales. Like, this is, you know, some kind of empowering feminist thing to have her up on this poster in a niqab. It is, what do they think Muslim women are? Do they think that they are some other species, that they don't feel the same way that every other human being feels, that they won't have the same reactions when they are being told as children, you need to wear this so that you can be good and pure and not burn in hell for eternity, versus those filthy girls that don't cover up? No man's ever going to marry them. They're dirty. They've got all of these. If you go online, you can see the propaganda. They've got posters of like a lollipop that's covered up, wrapped up in paper, and it's so nice and clean. And then you've got another lollipop that's uncovered, and it's covered in flies and dirt. And oh, nobody wants that lollipop. And they're telling girls, I mean, this stuff is made for children, right? Because they tell you this stuff as a child. You're indoctrinated into it. And so you put it on to please your family, and because you're scared, and because you don't want to be a filthy lollipop. And then you grow up and you realize, oh my God, this is ridiculous. I don't want anything to do with this. And so you remove it, and then that's when the backlash happens. There's a TED Talk with a Saudi Arabian woman who talks about, she was working in a rape center as a Muslim, as a hijabi Muslim woman. She was working in a rape center, and they were all standing around talking about victim blaming and slut shaming and everything. And she said, you know, she was there all powerful talking with them. And then she just had this moment where she's like, wow, am I the biggest hypocrite that I have this thing on my head as I'm supporting women who are victims of rape, and I'm speaking out against rape culture? And that's when she decided to take off her hijab, because she was enlightened. She finally realized that this thing is a tool of rape culture. And that is why when I started the hashtag, I mean, I only started the hashtag hijab is rape culture because Muslims got so angry when I equated it to rape culture. So I said, well, then it needs to be said. It needs to be identified. People need to recognize that this is absolutely a tool of rape culture. We talk about victim blaming here in the West, and we talk about slut shaming. You can't even see rape culture here as clearly as you can see it in the Muslim world, as clearly as you can see it with the hijab. I mean, talk about slut shaming. That's literally what the hijab says. It says, cover yourself up so that you will not be assaulted. Women who cover themselves up are clean and pure and good. Women who don't are filthy and dirty and will burn in hell. What could be more slut shaming than that? Victim blaming. Little girls are always told it's your responsibility to cover yourself up, because if you don't, then you are going to entice men, and then they are going to attack you. And that's because you didn't cover yourself up properly. We are told that all the time. And Seth, I cannot tell you how many young girls, including myself, didn't speak out when we were children because of that victim blaming, because we internalized it and we believed that we had something to do with it.
I'm not somebody who gets hung up on the word feminism. I mean, I like it from the standpoint of it focuses on elevating women's rights to those of men. Historically, it's been women who've been battling to try to close that gap, right? And I get that. I mean, if you want to say egalitarian or speak about gender equality using another term, I don't get hung up either way. I'm really more interested in the idea itself, the protection of rights and the elevation of the rights who have been oppressed. But I'll use the word feminism for our purposes here. You feel that Western feminism is very often misguided or ignoring the problems within Islam, correct?
I mean, I would love it if they would just ignore the problems within Islam. The problem is, it's not just that they ignore the problems within Islam. It's that, like I was saying, they actually support the fundamentalist side.
So
they're not
inadvertently
supporting the feminists.
Waving the banner of progression, they are empowering those who are oppressing women. Essentially, it's anti-feministic ideas being promoted under the banner of feminism?
Yes, exactly.
So what would you like to see change? What would you like to see feminists in the West and everywhere do differently?
I would like them to talk about Muslim women the same way they talk about themselves. I would like them to see us as no different from them. When we talk about all of these issues that we've been addressing that have to do with feminism, somehow, when it comes to Muslims, there's it's a completely different ball game. It's like when I said earlier, you could talk out against Scientology or against Mormonism or against Westboro Baptist Church or anything else. Nobody has any problem with that. As soon as you start to speak out against Islam, that's a different ball game. So that's the problem here, is that exceptionalism that Islam is given and that exceptionalism that Muslims are given. It's not a good thing. It is not helpful. You are not helping Muslim people by doing that. Now, to go back to Asr Nomani's article, what I liked about that article is that she was saying not all Muslim women like this thing. And so when you wear it in solidarity, you are not in solidarity with all Muslim women. You are only in solidarity with the fundamentalists. That's what they're not understanding. That they understand it in their own context. They understand it when, or even in the Jewish context, they can see that with Hasidic Jewish women and how they have to shave their heads and wear a wig when they're married, or how they have to wear long skirts or whatever. Like, you can see that in that context because it's more familiar to them. But the Islamic context is just not familiar. Islam is the second largest religion on the planet. It's time for it to become familiar. And, all of these years of us just, stereotyping and, misinformation, it wasn't a big deal. It didn't matter, didn't matter if people thought my Egyptian family lived in pyramids, ha ha ha, very funny. It wasn't important. Now it's important. Now people need to know. All of this mess that's happening in Iran right now, all of this confusion over Soleimani, that's because people don't know. People aren't aware. People don't see anything beyond their own borders. We don't have the luxury of doing that anymore. So people, these Western feminists, Western everybody need to start understanding what is going on in the Islamic world, what is going on with Muslim people, because they're going to keep on finding themselves on the wrong side of this fight. They're going to keep on finding themselves supporting the fundamentalists against their own values because they don't know what they're doing. If you're supporting somebody just because they happen to have brown skin or they happen to come from that country, then you don't know if you're supporting somebody who wants to throw gay people off of the highest rooftop or who happens to be gay themselves. You don't know. So you cannot take that shortcut. There's no shortcut. You have to start learning. You have to start understanding. I mean, we had vigils in Toronto and here in Canada, and it happened all over the Western world, where people were sad and lighting candles, not people, like Western people, sad and lighting candles for the death of a terrorist. It is no different than them being sad and lighting candles for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or for Osama bin Laden. That's how ridiculous it has become, because they don't know. They don't know what's happening on the other side of the world, and so they end up making these ridiculous, dangerous, horrible, decisions. And so that's why it's important that they understand what's going on so that they stop supporting the wrong side.
Yasmine Mohammed, tell me about Free Hearts, Free Minds.
I'm wearing that T-shirt right now.
Tell me all about it.
Right here.
And, Free Hearts, Free Minds. Thank you very much. What is it and how do people find it?
Free Hearts, Free Minds is an organization that I started to help support people who have left Islam but are still stuck in Muslim majority countries. I started it with Jimmy Bangesh, who is a counseling psychologist, or studying to be a counseling psychologist in the UK. He's an ex-Muslim himself. He was disowned by his family when they found out that he was gay. So even though he's from the UK, he very intimately understands the fundamentalist Islamic stronghold. And we have been very lucky in that we've been able to support a lot of people. And if you go to our website, you can click on testimonials and read about all the people that we've been able to help. And then I hope you'll also click on the donate button and consider helping us to help even more people.
Give me the website. Where do people go specifically?
freeheartsfreeminds.com.
Yasmine Mohammed. You can find her personal website at yasminemohammed.com, which I will link in the description box. She is author of Unveiled, How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam. Yasmine, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for your brave work. We'll continue to ring the bell, sound the alarm, get the word out. And in the meantime, all success with the book. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Seth.